things that she could build a life on, things that she had wanted since childhood and which, up to now, had seemed so distant and unreachable. Other people found love, other people found their soulmates and spent a happy life together. Why couldn't she? Stop it, she admonished herself, feeling him lean in closer. She breathed in his clean, masculine scent. Don't get ahead of yourself, just enjoy the moment. But dinner had gone so well, she thought. She'd thoroughly enjoyed their hours-long, easy conversation. He'd wanted to know all about the side business she ran in her spare time, her little online heirloom seeds company. Unlike others who'd only asked out of politeness, he seemed genuinely interested, asking her all about how she cultivated the seeds, how she chose which flowers to mix into her trademark bundles, how she maintained her large catalog and customers from around the world. Just when she'd been afraid that she'd monopolized the conversation, he'd added his own anecdotes about organic food and told her how much he admired her for preserving and encouraging a more natural approach. He told her about his dreams of opening a restaurant one day and playfully hinted that they might make a perfect team. It had been a wonderful evening, and now, sitting here with him, it all felt so right, so easy and perfect, and just as it should be. So why shouldn't she indulge in a little what if? Great couples had to get started somehow. He was so close now. He was going to angle his head and kiss her. She just knew it, and her heart began to pound. Alive with sensation and an almost desperate need to be touched, to be kissed, she parted her lips in subtle invitation and moved closer. And when he pressed his mouth to hers, the electric jolt of pleasure that fired through her almost made her cry out beneath his lips. His kiss was tentative at first, just a light brush of his mouth against hers, tasting her with velvet soft, sensuous lips, kissing her bottom lip, then the top, then returning to capture them both. She kissed him back, savoring his lips and the sweet sensation of his tongue just beyond the reach of hers. And when a small sound of pleasure escaped his lips and his mouth firmed against hers, she felt a trill of pleasure right down to her very core. He deepened the kiss, slanting his mouth over hers and gently sweeping his tongue against hers. Pleasure rocketed through her at the silken heat of his tongue, and she moaned into the kiss, which only seemed to spike his hunger. He ran his hand up her side to her breast and cupped it, groaning softly as he explored her mouth with deep, sensual strokes of his tongue. Their tongues tangled and entwined as they kissed and tasted and savored each other until finally, breathless and almost wild, he broke the kiss and gazed down at her. His ragged breath was warm against her lips, and she wanted nothing more than to kiss him again, to sink into the warm, decadent pleasure of his mouth. But he was pinning her with his eyes, looking wild, looking like a man on the brink of something beyond his breaking point. "I'm sorry if this is too fast," he breathed, his eyes searching hers as if the answer lay within their depths. I just want you, Kate. I wish I could be cooler about it, but I can't help it. I've wanted you for so long now I can barely stop myself." He looked so pained, so earnest, and the desire she heard in his voice was mingled with worry. He didn't want to stop, but he wanted to make sure that she didn't either, and his concern both touched and aroused her at the same time. "You don't have to stop," she whispered as their noses bumped and his breath tickled her eyelashes. "I want you to." A groan tore through him, and he took her mouth again, sinking into a delicious, rhythmic kiss that threatened to overwhelm her. In one fluid moment he was over her, guiding her back gently against the couch cushions, lowering them both as he kissed and tasted and explored. God, there was nothing like this feeling, she thought, closing her eyes and focusing on the comfortable heaviness of his body on hers. It had been so long, too long, since she'd been with a man. Too long since she'd felt strong arms around her, felt the rasp of stubble against her lips and skin. Far too long. And more than that, it had been too long since it had felt so right, so perfectly, effortlessly right. Moments like this were so rare and so fleeting, but maybe this time, maybe with this man. His lips trailed kisses down her neck and over the crest of her collarbone, down, down, until she felt his hand deftly unbuttoning her blouse. His mouth was hot and warm against the cool flesh of her breast, kissing and teasing, lower and lower, until he nudged aside the cup of her bra and took her nipple into his mouth with a throaty groan. "You're so beautiful," he moaned, licking and teasing her nipple as it hardened beneath his tongue. "God damn it, Kate, your tits are amazing." She hadn't expected him to say tits, but he was lost in desire, and sometimes harsher words only enhanced the pleasure, and she couldn't deny the little flush of pride that warmed her at his appraisal. She sank her fingers into his hair and held him as he lavished her breasts. His breath hitched, and the long, hard length of his erection surged against her as he grew even more aroused. "Are you on the pill?" he murmured, moving his lips up her chest to her neck and earlobe. She nodded mutely, and he chuckled softly, a delicious little sound of satisfaction. "Good. I hate rubbers. I don't want to feel anything between us." He pulled back and gazed down at her, his eyes searching hers meaningfully. In the dim light, his eyes were large and dark, but she saw such tenderness in them, such wonder, that her heart began to beat even faster. It wasn't love. She knew it couldn't yet be called love, but the connection between them, the way their eyes seemed to lock on each other, the way he reached down to tenderly brush a strand of hair from her face. God, it was magical. Like an awakening, she thought blissfully. Like they'd only just awoken to this new sensation, this new possibility between them, and it was so much more intense, so much more moving than either of them could have imagined. It was wonder, she decided. It was wonder that she saw in his eyes, and wonder she felt glowing back at him. "I don't want to wait a minute longer," he murmured, and she felt his hands fumbling for his belt and zipper. "I want to be inside you. Now." God, yes. His words thrilled her. She liked foreplay as much as the next girl, but when it came to pure, primal passion, nothing beat aching, urgent sex. Foreplay was just that. Play. And this was nothing like play. This was hot need and hunger and something beyond the simple pleasures of the flesh. She reached down and shimmied her skirt up over her hips, his large, warm hands helping her. Skimming over her flesh, his fingers hooked under the lace of her panties and pulled them to one side. He wasn't even going to take them off, she thought with a wild surge of pleasure. He wanted her so badly, they weren't even going to undress. They were going to make love right here on the couch, fully clothed, and something about the urgency of it made her almost dizzy with desire. Should she stop him? If she wanted to slow things down, she'd have to do it now, before they both got carried away. She had no doubt he would stop if she wanted him to, but did she want him to? Should she want him to? Her heart fluttered in her chest as her mind scrambled, and then he was kissing her again, convincing her with his lips and his hands and his soft moans of pleasure. Everywhere she touched was warm and solid and masculine. Every angle of his body, every defined line of muscle felt so right. No pressure, no coercion, just simple male desire guiding his hands and his mouth as they explored her body and ignited her senses. No, she wouldn't stop him. She'd let passion carry her away. She'd give in to this most natural and wonderful of life's pleasures. She'd just go with it. She'd just let things take their course and savor this delicious electricity between them, because she knew, she could feel it down to her toes. This was no ordinary roll in the hay, and he was no ordinary man. He could very well be, the one. She felt the tip of his cock press against her opening, but he paused and smiled down at her, mutely questioning, silently confirming that she wanted this too. She craned her neck up and kissed him in answer, and in one swift motion, he was inside. At first she felt the familiar tight sensation of being penetrated, the mild discomfort of her body adjusting to his cock. It really had been too long, she thought ruefully, as her muscles gripped him and he groaned against her neck. But when he began to move, she felt that first blissful wave of pleasure wash through her, and she relaxed. He moved fluidly, slowly, thrusting deep and withdrawing fully, his hips flexing as he worked to control the pace. She moved her hands to his backside, gliding over the large muscles beneath the bunched-up fabric of his pants. Pushing his pants down further, she pulled him against her, and he groaned his approval, thrusting himself into her even deeper, in sync with the gentle encouragement of her hands. Soon he was stroking into her steadily, his pace increasing to match the rhythm of his breath against her neck. Little electric shocks of pleasure spasmed through her as the sweet, throbbing need in her clit began to grow. His relentless rhythm increased, and she moaned softly as new sensations tingled through her. Her moans seemed to deepen his thrusts and bring out soft groans of his own as he lifted his head and gazed down at her. Desire burned in his eyes and intensified the breathless, panting ecstasy of their bodies moving together. She couldn't take her eyes off his. It was as if the joining of their bodies was just an afterthought, that it was the connection in their eyes that blazed hot and bright. His hand moved to gently cup her face, then slide along her jaw into her hair, and then he lowered his mouth to hers and kissed her on a muffled groan. Pleasure fired through her as she kissed him back, savoring the feel of his tongue mingling with hers in a rhythm that matched his languidly thrusting cock. When he had to break the kiss for air, he buried his face against her neck and groaned, his hips flexing faster as he took her even deeper, angling her hips up so he could reach new depths of pleasure in them both. She heard soft moans and whimpers and knew she was making these sounds, completely lost in the pleasure of his body claiming hers. So primal and ancient, this primitive dance that was somehow uniquely human, made more elegant and soulful and sensuously pleasurable by the mere meeting of lips and eyes and hearts. Nature's plan, God's benediction, whatever it was pure bliss. And she began to feel weightless and free beneath the steady, relentless grinding of his hips against hers. "You like my cock, baby?" he whispered then, all but out of breath. "Come on, tell me you like my big cock." She wasn't a prude when it came to sex talk, but something about the way he asked, something too harsh and brittle in his tone, cooled her mounting pleasure a little. But then his strokes quickened and she moaned. The pleasure was undeniable and inescapable, and as she arched her back and let her head fall back against the pillow, she whispered what he wanted to hear. "I love your cock." "Yeah, baby, you love that cock," he whispered harshly, a little laugh stuttering through his words. "You want to come on this cock, don't you, baby? Don't you?" She did. She really did. She knew how explosive the pleasure could be, riding the crest of an orgasm as a man thrust relentlessly into her. She murmured her assent and pulled him against her more forcefully, feeling nothing but an aching need for release. Come on, baby, come for me," he urged her on hoarsely, staring down at her now with such fiery need as his hips churned against her. "I can't hold out much fucking longer. I need you to fucking come on my cock." His voice nearly broke on the harsh words, and she felt his straining control beginning to break. He was holding out, wanting to give her pleasure before he took his own. Even at the height of his need, he was intent on pleasuring her first, and something about that gesture, that simple aching need, spurred her on. She felt her orgasm begin to build, the pressure growing and growing, the raw, delicious pleasure of his thrusts bringing her closer and closer to the edge until she felt him begin to tense with his own imminent release. His voice soared on breathless moans of escalating pitch until he growled out an explosion of breath and slammed his cock into her with short, fast strokes. She closed her eyes and felt her own detonation of pleasure as she joined him in crashing over the edge. It was over so quickly, like her orgasms always were. little more than a sharp jolt of pleasure, and then a cascade of relief. His orgasm, though, was so wrenching and savage that she watched him, mesmerized, as pleasure contorted his face and racked his rigid body. He grunted and panted as he stroked into her a few more times, pausing as the pleasure shuddered through him until finally his hips stilled, and he just breathed hard against her, leaving a wet trail of saliva against her neck from his ragged breaths. His groans grew softer, and his breathing finally began to slow. She reached up and put her arms around his neck, kissing the skin beneath his ear to help calm him. She felt like a benevolent goddess, cradling a man in her arms as he all but died from the pleasure her body gave him. Conceit, maybe, but she didn't care. Afterglow, oh, delicious afterglow, the heady, breathless moments after the torrent of lust, the come down after the explosive frenzy of desire and need. She loved this part. She loved the gentle gazes, and the wild-eyed wonder, and the caresses, and the pillow talk, and the cuddling. True, she'd never really experienced much of it with previous lovers, but this time she could see it in his eyes. He was feeling it too, those wonderful endorphins, those hormones that make lovers feel close. He smiled down at her, taking in her face as though assessing her and liking what he found. And she knew. He was aglow with pleasure and wonder and something that someday they might both call love. After a few moments, he finally straightened up and blew out a breath with a broad, happy smile. He crawled off her inelegantly and half stumbled into her coffee table before rising up to his full height and running his hands through his hair like a marathoner at the finish line. "Whew," he said. "That was fucking intense. God damn." Something about the way his unzipped pants fell away to the sides, the way his unbuckled belt dangled limply down his thigh, made her suddenly feel ridiculous, like they were teenagers getting it on in the back seat, or clandestine lovers trysting in the copier room. She adjusted her panties and skirt with a self-conscious laugh and sat up. "It certainly was," she said. She swung her feet around so he could sit down beside her again, but to her surprise he collapsed into the armchair across from the couch. He let his head fall back as he continued to catch his breath. After a few moments, he lifted his head up and smiled at her as he began to zip himself up. "We gotta do this again," he said, tucking his shirt back into his waistband. "That was the best fuck I've had in years." She blinked, trying to keep the smile on her face, but almost certainly failing. "Okay, so what? He calls it a fuck. So what? That's what some people call it. No big deal." It was hardly lovemaking, she knew that. And that was okay. As first times together went, it had been pretty exciting. "Do you," she began, and then paused as he reached down for the shoes he'd taken off before they'd sat down. He slid them over his feet and began lacing them up. "Do I what?" he asked. He looked at her when she didn't answer and his eyebrows rose. "Something wrong? You came, didn't you?" Yes, of course, she said, confusion making her stammer. I just wondered if, well, I wondered if you wanted to stay over, but I guess not," she finished, watching as he put both shoed feet on the floor and rose. No, not tonight. I'm sorry. I gotta get up early. I got a long drive back to my place, too. Another time, I promise." She stood and followed him as he moved towards the door, disappointment and alarm beginning to creep through her. This wasn't right, she thought. Not right at all. They had just, okay, fucked. But it had been passionate and soulful and intense. It had been their first time together. She wasn't expecting a marriage proposal, but she certainly hadn't expected him to just get up and leave. "But, don't you even want to shower?" She lowered her voice discreetly on the last word, hardly believing she even had to suggest it. "I mean, I know I do. You're welcome to stay, and God, what did one say? Wash me off you? Clean up your crotch? She started to feel sick. You're welcome to stay and freshen up if you like. I'm good, he grinned. More than good. Any other night I would stay, but like I said, I gotta go. I wasn't expecting this tonight. I'm sorry. I should have planned it a bit better. He had spent hours talking with her at dinner. They'd been nuzzling on the couch for nearly an hour before they'd finally kissed. He'd never said anything about having to be up early or having a long drive home. She wanted to blurt this out to him, vainly hoping that he'd see her logic and change his mind. But she knew better. Listen, I'll give you a call, he said, as he reached the front door to her apartment. He retrieved his jacket from the hook by the door and fished his smartphone out of his pocket, thumbing through the text messages that had come in. Lloyd, she said. The unspoken question dangled on the end of his name and fell away. He looked up inquisitively, and seeing the expression on her face, his own expression softened a bit, and he slipped his phone back into his pocket. He stepped closer and slipped his hand around her waist, pulling her close to him for a sensual kiss. The same soft lips, the same searching mouth teasing and tasting her so sensually. She actually felt a flare of desire flutter through her again, and she kissed him back eagerly, a small part of her hoping he'd drop his jacket and walk her backwards to her bedroom. Like in the movies, when busy men threw caution to the wind and were made happily late for work in the arms of their new love. But he broke the kiss and smiled down at her, his eyes sparkling. I had a great time tonight, Kate. I really, really like you. I just don't want to take things too fast, you know? Too fast? They had just fucked on her couch, she thought, on their first date. What did he mean, too fast? I don't feel comfortable just leaving it like this, she finally managed, trying to contain her disappointment, her bewilderment, her growing sense of indignation. I think we should at least talk about this. Look, Kate, I'm sorry, but I really do have to go. I promise, we can talk all you want tomorrow. We'll do dinner, we can talk then. For now, just enjoy the buzz, okay? He lowered his head to her mouth and kissed her again. I'll definitely be back for more, don't you worry. You're a great fuck. A great fuck. She felt a knot of nausea begin to punch a hole in her stomach. I just don't want to get into anything serious, that's all, he went on, obviously seeing the blanched look on her face. Maybe we shouldn't have gone for it tonight, but hey, we're both adults, we're both single. Maybe we'll want to keep seeing each other, maybe it'll go somewhere, you never know. Like I said, I really do like you. She stared at him, feeling tears begin to prick at her eyes. She wasn't going to cry over him, over this ridiculous situation. Come on, Kate, he cajoled in a laugh, his voice reedy and petulant. I mean it was really, really great, but come on, it was just a hookup, you know? I mean, we barely know each other, but we're both pretty hot, and it just felt right, you know? It doesn't really mean anything. Or it shouldn't, anyway. It shouldn't mean anything, she echoed faintly. I'm not trying to be an asshole. I just mean, God, you're not one of those religious nuts, are you? Thinking we're engaged now or something? He laughed and tried to get her to laugh with him. When she didn't, he sobered, chastened. Okay, I'm sorry. Honestly, I just don't know what to say. The women I've dated have always been very cool. I'm just not used to someone wanting me to stay. It could have been a tender statement, but it wasn't. He could have been telling her that his previous lovers had been too aloof to care about him, but he wasn't. The bafflement on his face made his meaning clear. They were cool because they hadn't wanted him to stay, and he had no interest in someone who did. Tomorrow's Saturday, I'll call you. We'll get together, he assured her, sliding his arms into his jacket and retrieving his keys. It'll be fine, I promise. You're incredible. He leaned down and kissed her again, and didn't seem to notice the stillness of her lips beneath his. Have a good night, he said softly, and was gone. She stood motionless for a moment, watching the lock chain swinging against the closed door, following the peeling arc that years of use had worn into the white paint. She could hear the faint ticking of her kitchen clock, and somewhere, distantly, the watery, muted sound of someone's television. It was deafening. The tears came then, and she was grateful at least that they hadn't begun to stream down her face while he'd been standing there, because he'd have misunderstood. He'd have thought the tears were for him. She moved quietly through her apartment to the bathroom, determined not to cry out loud, even though there was no one around to hear it or care. She'd fallen for it again, she thought, as she stripped down, turned the squeaky hot water tap in the shower, and let the water wash her clean. The dream, the fantasy, the illusion of romantic love and sex. She was nearly 30 years old. The big day was exactly a week away, in fact, and so far she'd had a grand total of 5 relationships. Well, 6, if tonight's great fuck counted. Each one had been unique in how it had started, how quickly it had become sexual, and how long it had lasted, but so far, the common thread was her lover's staggering lack of interest in becoming serious. Was it her? She had thought about this so often, her head hurt just asking the question. Was she radiating neediness or clinginess to these men? She honestly didn't think so. Sometimes the subject of commitment had been raised by her, sometimes by him. Sometimes it had never come up. It had just been clear that the relationship wasn't going in that direction. Sometimes she'd waited for a month or more of dating to become sexual. Sometimes, like tonight, she'd let her hormones get the better of her and moved quickly. But every single time, something had gone terribly wrong. Breakups over not wanting to settle down. Huge fights over a pregnancy false alarm. A 2-year relationship severed overnight because he'd been offered a job in Europe and had leaped at it without a second thought, and without asking her to come with him. Her last relationship had ended 10 months ago, when she'd come home early to find him in bed with their neighbor. And instead of expressing shock or contrition, he'd cheekily suggested she join them. Over and over again, that lack of connection, that callous, throwaway attitude towards love, like it didn't matter. Like it was as fragile and ephemeral as flower petals, stirred and scattered by the slightest breeze. To the men she'd been drawn to, everything else came first. Jobs, friends, other women. Once she'd even been stood up in favor of a video game. She rested her head against the shower wall and let the hot water soothe her tense shoulders. She couldn't deny it any longer. Clearly, she was doing something wrong. Either it was her choice in men, or something about her just made men not want to commit. Maybe it was both. But no matter how miserable she felt, no matter how pathetically the tears mingled with the rivulets of water streaming down her face, she just couldn't bring herself to believe she was some freak of nature. Images from earlier in the evening filled her mind. The way he'd gazed at her, the way he'd kissed her, the way he'd whispered and murmured to her. There had been something there, she'd been sure of it. The passionate lovemaking, the overwhelming sensuality, the desire and longing she'd seen in his gaze. She didn't expect him to be in love with her. She didn't want false declarations or lies. But how could he have been so passionate with her, and yet feel absolutely nothing the second it was over? How was that even possible? How could he gaze at her like she was a goddess who had ravaged his soul, and then hightail it out the door not 10 minutes later saying, "You're a great fuck, but let's not move too fast"? If it had been mechanical and soulless, she'd have understood. If he just wanted to get off, fine. But he had made love to her with passion and what had felt like desperation. How could someone do that? How could a man make love to a woman like she was his very soul, and then just leave? Suddenly, their months of friendship at work now seemed hollow and meaningless too, as though all their fun times together had just been the prelude to the hookup he thought they both wanted. The tears came hot and fast now. She was 30 years old, and this was all she had. A cold, empty apartment and nothing but meaningless hookups and wasted years of her life. It had to stop. She had to change her life. She closed her eyes and imagined scenes from her favorite movie, It's a Wonderful Life. There was something so innocent and charming about George and Mary Bailey's happy little rundown house on Sycamore Lane, with the drafty windows and the wobbly old newel post, a house that they filled with family and friends and love. Why couldn't life be as simple and beautiful as that? Two people who cared for each other, raising their children, working together to live a wonderful life. She held fast to the little fantasy that had always comforted her when her previous attempts at relationships had failed. A large house in the country, with kids and dogs running around the yard, with family and friends coming around, staying for dinner, showing up for Christmas in outrageously bad sweaters, and a greenhouse for her to tend to lovingly, in which to grow her heirloom plants. But most of all, a companionable, loving life partner, a strong, steady, mature man to navigate life with, to raise children with, to run a business with. A husband. No more fucking around, she thought, her eyes flying open, literally and figuratively. It was going to stop right now. She wasn't going to waste another minute of her precious life on throwaway guys who made her feel like a princess only long enough to orgasm and then were out the door. She was done focusing on romantic love. It was all a crock and completely unnecessary. Maybe some people got lucky and found romance with the right person, but she hadn't managed to do it in 30 years. And most people she knew who had enjoyed whirlwind romances were broken up by the second or third year at most, sometimes with divorces and kids as part of the wreckage. Now, she was going to change her life, starting right now. It all came to her so easily, like the tumblers of a lock clicking smoothly into place. She didn't want to face Lloyd at work after what had happened. It was a mindless, soul-numbing job anyway. She'd hated it for years. She'd email her notice and use up the vacation days that HR had been pestering her to take. She had been saving up, working diligently at her little business nights and weekends. She could do it. She would take the plunge. But not here, not in this city. It was too crowded and too urban, too full of Lloyds. Now, if she wanted to find a husband and settle down in a quiet, peaceful, wonderful life, she needed to go someplace quiet, peaceful, and wonderful. She needed to go home.